Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Spore Viewer Creations Reborn, where you submit your own creations and I recreate them in my own visions and ideas. And for the very first creation of this video, we have the mocha corian by Minotaur. So when I first saw the look of this creature, I had a bit of a kind of horror-ish or scary-ish kind of creature design in mind, especially because the long, almost skeletal-like limbs, the really large aggressive claws, and the eye inside the leech mouth. And so for my first choice of design, I wanted to give the creature these large, broad ribs, since I just kind of like the idea of a bit of a zombie-ish kind of look to it. Whereas with the limbs, I used the regular core spore limbs for the thighs and biceps, but for the shins and the forearms, I replaced them with the exoskeleton parts from Replicant. That way they inherit their original colour scheme, but it makes the creature look a little bit more angular, got a little bit more spike to it. I kept the original feet because I didn't want to change it too much, but I did give it a bit of a greyish kind of silver armour plating or chitinous plating, depending on how you look at it. I wanted to make the mouth pretty much the same because the way that Liam had decided to put an eye instead of the mouth was just a really unusual idea, and I felt like that's such a characteristic part of this creature, I didn't want to just get rid of it entirely. So that remains to be exactly the same, as does the horn cresting. Though for the horns, I did end up adding a couple of little extra smaller ones, just to make it a little bit different, but overall the same thing. And I did see that it had some very large fur going down its back and neck, so I decided to add a little bit more fur to this. Since previously it looked a little bit naked or bare in my opinion, it was very featureless, which is often okay for creations, but I felt like with this one I could just give it a little bit more detail, and I decided to do that via a couple of little bony pieces here and there, such as the hips, the shoulders, and a bit of fur around the head and around the joints. Since I'm making a lot of the bones quite pronounced, it also made sense to add a vertebrae and just make the spine look big and spiky as well, although the spine will end up being mostly covered in fur, just as the original creation is too. And in the end, we have what looks like a bit of a big brother, or perhaps even a caveman variant. Since this one looks very bulkier and overall fluffier, I guess you could argue a bit more primitive or even just a bit beefier overall. But ultimately, like I said, I tried to keep very close to the original design while still just making it a bit more me. And for the second creation of the day, we have the Shadow Snare by Logan. This is a dark, luminescent coloured fish creature with pronounced ribs sticking out to fool us prey into thinking that it is a carcass and therefore can lure creatures into attack. Now, fish is something I'm not very experienced with, so it was a little bit tricky to try and reimagine this myself. Overall, I ended up making this one just a lot larger. I wanted the ribs to be much more pronounced and much larger. The head, I did want to try and approach the head differently, but the more I thought about it, the more I experimented with different parts, in the end, I really liked Logan's original method of using the water weather part from Creepy and Cute. Since a funny little trick of Spore is that when you make the base coat of a creature pure black, it actually illuminates the other colours instead. Never really known why or if it was intended, but it allows for some very bright neon colorations. And the water weather, as you'll see later on, all the little spikes and tips end up being a very luminous bright blue. And I thought that's just a really cool technique that Logan had done for this, and I really didn't want to change it, so in the end I kind of just made it like a little bit bigger. For the fins, I made the fins much larger, since I felt like that in Logan's one, it kind of covered up the ribs, and the ribs are such an interesting different design. So for mine, I wanted the fin limbs to kind of curve around the spine and just make it kind of feel like there's a bit more weight or broadness to the creature, even though technically speaking it will still look like a corpse, and therefore the ribcage will still be relatively empty-ish. It still just kind of felt nice to make it, again, quite broader and much more spikier. I also elected to use a couple of whip wicks here and there because this gives me the vibe of a large creature that is dwelling deep in the ocean, hence all the bioluminescence. And one that I kind of find synonymous with these kind of designs is tendrils. So I wanted to make the fins even larger, add a bit of tendrils a little bit to the bottom jaw, and later on along the tail as well. Speaking of the tail, I think I actually made mine a little bit too long. I do believe I was overcompensating with the tail, but once again, I did like Logan's original design, so I elected just to kind of recreate his design and then just add more parts to it to try and kind of complicate it a bit and give it more visual noise. And then for the finishing touch, one more technique he had used was to use a couple of illuminated acorns along the body for a bit of patterning. So I went ahead and used many more of those to add more patterning along the creature, and when it came to the texturing, I'd experimented with a couple of different patterns and stripes here and there. I ended up finding a modded one from either Skincraft or Delta's Paints, and it kind of gave this very scratchy, veiny looking texture all over. Not like the Creepy and Cute one, but a bit different, and it just felt very fitting for the overall colour scheme. And then moving on to our third creation, we had the Iska by Spore G. The Iska provided a good opportunity for me to finally experiment with the crystal parts, because even the crystal parts are a regular core spore vanilla part that's been in the game for the entirety of its lifetime. There are parts I very rarely use and I find very tacky and tricky to deal with. So the fact that this was a main feature for the iska meant, alright then, I really had to buckle down and actually figure out how to use this part and try to make it all look nice. From my understanding, the iska is a subterranean creature that burrows out. So for inspiration, I kind of imagined something very rocky and sturdy looking. I recreated the back feet because in the original they were these large kind of hoof-like feet, whereas in my one I wanted them to be much more claw-like but still very broad. The arms and hands are pretty much the same, however I did replace some of the core limbs with exoskeleton limbs from replicants once again because I really like the texture of those lately. And next up it came to the crystal back itself. Now for this, I really wanted to use a lot of parts to make this crystal look very heavy and very covered. I wanted to be able to camouflage or just have a really awesome display. And for this, I had to interchange between all the different type of crystal parts. So I tried to utilize all of them, or at least maybe not the first one as much, because that first really cheap one that you get for 25 DNA, that one just kind of sucks in my opinion, but the rest of them I tried to utilize a lot. Different shapes, different sizes, combine them all in between and try to cover literally the entirety of the upper half of the creature, including his back, neck and tail, and even around the thighs and shoulders as well. And then to try and balance it all out, I added a couple of shell shards, horror lumps, and various other parts to the chest, the collarbone, and other places to make the creature look more evenly armored. And then for the color scheme, while I wanted to go pretty much the same thing as the original, I wanted to make it look just a little bit rockier and a little bit more richer. Overall, very pleased with this creation. And next up, for the fourth creation of the video, we have the akatas by Itsarians. The akatas were first described as a fox-like race inspired by the groks, and that gave me a very clear visual as to what to do. So I wanted to make my one a little bit more bipedal and upright. And starting the legs, I spent a little bit more time on the feet than I normally would. I really wanted to look like it had these long, nimble feet as opposed to just like an extra joint in the legs. So I spent a fair bit of time trying out a new technique to try and make the individual toes a bit more independent. And then once I took a step back to see just how the feet look and how overcomplicated they were compared to the rest of the creature, the rest of the creature had an overall very simplistic form, so I immediately added a bit more fur everywhere just to give it a bit more silhouette, a bit more noise overall. Since, as Groxka mentioned, it was a fox-like race, I thought, well, there isn't really a lot of fox in this, in my personal opinion, so I figured that a big fox-like tail would help, and also because previously they had like a very large raptor-like tail, which really worked for a creature that had a bit more of a raptor-like stance as their original one did, but since I'm making my own a bit more bipedal, I figured a long, stiff tail sticking out would look a little bit strange, but a fox-like tail, on the other hand, would have complemented it wonderfully. And in the end, if I'm honest, the majority of this creature is just adding lots and lots of fur. I wanted to have a bit of thought as to where I added fur, just to try and give it a bit of character. So quite a bit fair mane along the back of the head, the neck, the back, and the little tufts around the chest, the elbows, the ankles, the knees, just to give it some subtle detailing. And then when it came to the face, I wanted the face to be the exact same as the original, just with the addition of having the more grox-like eyes instead of the coarse eyes that they originally used. And then I changed the patterning on my one just a little bit to make it look a little bit richer and to make the whites of the tail not quite as secluded. And then for our fifth and not quite final creation, we have the shredderraptor by Zodatron. So the shredderraptor looked to be this very sleek, streamlined, very hunched forward and downwards kind of raptor-like creature covered in very dark feathers. And it gave me the overall vibe of a nocturnal or perhaps more camouflaged predator. So I wanted to try and make my proportions as similar to theirs as possible while still trying to give it a bit more anatomy, if you will. For the feathers, I wanted the feathers to be richer, I wanted them to be overlapping, so I used two different types to have different colorations as well as different patterns, and just to make it look overall very full. In Zodatron's original, they covered the entire back in feathers, and I didn't really want to do that because in my personal opinion, it just doesn't look very good in Spore when you cover a creature entirely in feathers. I find very niche scenarios where it looks good, whereas I prefer to cover certain areas to give the effect that certain areas are just larger, more broader, as opposed to the entire creature just being awkwardly covered. It's a bit hard to describe, but I hope that the comparison before and after kind of shows it a little bit. I loved the ear function I used for the face. I'm not sure if the facial cresting actually are ears or if it was just a clever use of the part, but I definitely kept that in. Tried to make the face overall the exact same. Really added emphasis to the feather integuments along the face as well, and in the end just tried to bulk it up more. And then for the color scheme, once again went with the same as the original, just a little bit more vibrant. Now, as the fifth creation of this video, the shredraptor did indeed get voted by the community to be the next ZBrush one. And I swear, you guys just love voting for the complicated feathered creations. So this one was once again a bit of a task. For my ZBrush model, instead of immediately remeshing the creature like I normally would, instead this time round, I just went straight for the feathers. Those are the parts I know would give me the most grief, and so I just went ahead and tried to recreate every feather I possibly could. Overall, still going for a bit of a light cartoonish design, design, but something that will hopefully still be reminiscent of Spore by the end. And this creature has many feathers all over, so it was important I tried to tackle as many as I could. For the claws, same technique. I made the claws and hands and feet separate. That way they can remain nice and distinct in the final model and have a very clear-cut color. And then once I was happy with all the features and integument, instead of remeshing the current Spore creation I had, what I had done was I went into Spore, I took all the feathers off of the shredderraptor, and then I exported that one instead, because that would just make my life so much easier. Instead of trying to remove all the feathers from the original mesh, it just meant I now had a second mesh to work with, much more bold, naked one, but one that I could remesh and unmesh easily and make it fit with all the new feathers and claws I just added in. It may sound a little bit overcomplicated, but it was a massive convenience and saved so much time. Now, to actually get the feathers to fit in with the creature, I elected just to pull out all the mesh and just add all these little bumps here and there. Since again, going for a bit more of a slightly cartoonish-ish kind of thing, I feel like that style works the best as Spore creations because, again, it just makes it a bit more reminiscent and more familiar, as opposed to painstakingly making everything semi-realistic, which would be fun, but would take so much longer. And I wouldn't be able to do that every single week. Still, trying to strike a nice aesthetic balance here, and whilst I was happy with the way that everything kind of fitted together, such as the facial ears, the eyes, and of course all the feathers, my next task was to add in all the fur. Well, I say fur, maybe not necessarily fur, but the fur tool nonetheless to try and shape it all together. However, when I looked at the colours and textures I used for my creation, it did have a couple little bumps here and there, and I wasn't sure if I wanted this creature to be completely feathered. So in the end, I did add a couple of scales in as well, just kind of more dull, much larger, broader scales. So nothing too intense, but it still showed a bit of variation along the skin of the mesh, and it meant that when I coloured it in, it would really make it pop out more. For the colours, I really tried to go the exact same as the original, and that even includes the weird brownish hues that you get around the hands, feet, and mouth, because I really like the way that appears, and I thought it'd be a nice way to just make the mouth more distinct from the ear, head cresting, as well as help make the eyes pop out more. And my overall technique with the colours was to use the colour spray tool, which would kind of spray the alpha I had and use like random shades and hues, which gives a bit more randomness overall. And I'll do all of that with the cavity mask enabled, so that, in other words, it means it's a bit of a dry brushing technique, essentially, where it only paints the upper levels or the upper mountains of the mesh, and it leaves all the creases and crevices dark or whatever original coloration they had. If you're familiar with dry brushing in real clay modeling, it is literally the exact same process. And I gotta say, I really love the colors of this. I just love the contrast of the red and the feathers, and I was such a nice touch from Zerdatron in their original creation, and I feel like it pops out really nicely in the ZBrush one. And then we have our 5 creations complete. Once again, a really lovely variety. We have one with feathers, one with fur, one that's a fish, one that's an undead humanoid, and one that is a rocky elemental creature. I love the variety, it's so cool, and thank you all so much for submitting these. These were a lot of fun to make, and as always, I really hope that you've enjoyed both the process and the results. Thank you all so much, and I'll see you all next week for another round of Viewer Creations Reborn. Take care, and have a wonderful day. Cheers.